Chapter 1. The Detective and the Black Rose. The rain fell gently, like glass tears, over the streets of New York. In that early autumn, the city seemed shrouded in a mantle of mystery and darkness. Jack Malone, a police veteran with a scar running across the left side of his face, walked slowly along the damp sidewalks, his dark overcoat brushing against his ankles. He was a well-known figure in the city, a man of few words and many stories, a cynical detective driven by an unshakable sense of justice. Malone stopped in front of the corner cafe where he usually started his mornings. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the smell of wet asphalt, creating a familiar symphony for his tired senses. He had barely taken the first sip when his phone rang, interrupting that brief moment of peace. It was Lieutenant O'Hara, his deep voice echoing on the other end of the line. "Malone, we have a case for you. Central Park. A body has been found." Jack sighed, leaving the coffee cup half full. He knew that quiet days were rare in his profession, and something in the lieutenant's voice suggested that this case would be different. He grabbed his hat, adjusted it on his head, and headed towards the park, where the morning mist still danced among the trees. Upon arriving at the crime scene, he was met by a nervous young officer, whose hands trembled as he lifted the yellow crime scene tape. The scene unfolding before Jack's eyes was unsettling. In the middle of a clearing, the body of a young woman lay on the wet grass. But it wasn't just the body that caught his attention. Next to her, carefully placed, was a black rose, a rare flower of somber beauty that seemed to absorb all the light around it. Jack crouched down, closely observing the scene. The woman, identified as Emily Turner, had a strangely peaceful expression, almost as if she were sleeping. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that she had resisted. Only the black rose, a detail that already sparked a series of questions in the detective's mind. "Has anyone seen anything like this before?" he asked the officer beside him. "No, sir. This is new to all of us." Jack put on a pair of gloves and carefully examined the flower. There were no thorns, nothing that could provide an immediate clue. But something about that rose seemed out of place, as if it were a silent message from the killer. "Do we have any initial leads?" Jack asked, standing up and looking around. "We found this note in her pocket, sir." The young officer handed him a small folded piece of paper. Jack opened the note, revealing a message written in elegant handwriting. "Beauty is but the shadow of death." The Raven. The detective frowned. The reference to The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe was disturbing. He knew he was dealing with someone who was not only a killer, but also a player, someone who wanted to be found, who wanted to be challenged. "Prepare for a long night, gentlemen," said Jack, tucking the note into his coat pocket. "This is not an ordinary case, and our time is running out." As the mist began to dissipate, revealing more details of the surrounding scene, Jack Malone felt the weight of the challenge forming before him. He knew that every minute counted, and that this killer would leave a trail of mystery and pain wherever they went. And so, with the black rose as the symbol of a dark enigma, the hunt began in the heart of New York. Chapter 2. The Night of Shadows. The sun was already low on the horizon when Jack Malone entered his office. The room was a mixture of disarray and functionality, with files stacked in corners and an old wooden desk covered in papers. The walls were adorned with newspaper clippings, photos of solved cases, and a corkboard full of clues and connections from ongoing investigations. It was the place where he spent more time than he cared to admit, but that day, it seemed he would spend even more. He sat at his desk, took the note found in Emily Turner's pocket, and placed it under the lamp's light. "Beauty is but the shadow of death." The Raven. The words echoed in his mind as he scrutinized every detail. Why a black rose? And why, quote, Poe? Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, a knock on the door interrupted him. It was Sarah Carter, his longtime assistant and confidant. With her keen eyes and sharp mind, Sarah was indispensable in complex cases like this one. "Jack, I did some research on the Black Rose," she said, entering with a folder in hand. "It's an extremely rare flower. Ordering something like this wouldn't be easy. It could lead us to the supplier." Jack nodded, taking the folder and beginning to leaf through it. "Good idea, Sarah. And the note? Any leads?" "We're still analyzing the handwriting, but it appears to be written with a fountain pen, something few people use these days. We're checking stores that still sell this type of material." Jack knew that every little detail could be crucial. He needed to connect the dots quickly. The killer had already made the first move, and now it was his turn to respond. "What about Emily?" Jack asked, turning his attention back to the assistant. "We're looking into her life," Sarah replied. "She was an art student at New York University, known for her passion for classic literature. Curious, isn't it? A young woman so interested in poetry, murdered with a direct reference to Poe." Jack leaned back in his chair, considering the coincidence. He knew there were no coincidences in his line of work. Everything was connected, in one way or another. "We need to talk to those who knew her, friends, classmates, professors. Someone might have seen or heard something that could help us." Sarah nodded, already picking up the phone to start arranging the interviews. While she did that, Jack looked again at the photo of Emily in the folder. She seemed so alive in the image, so full of dreams and promises. He promised himself that he would bring her justice. So hours later, as night enveloped the city in its dark veil, Jack and Sarah found themselves in front of the dorm where Emily lived. The yellow streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, adding an even darker air to the investigation. They began interviewing Emily's classmates, each conversation revealing small details about her life and personality. During one of these conversations, a classmate mentioned something curious. "Emily had started dating recently," said the young woman. "A girl with dark hair and sad eyes. But she never said his name. She only mentioned that he was very intellectual and liked poetry." Jack made a mental note. A mysterious boyfriend with a taste for poetry. Another piece of the puzzle. "And what about the club?" Sarah asked. "The club Emily frequented?" "Oh, the Elysium," the classmate replied. "It's an exclusive club in Manhattan. Emily said she loved the atmosphere there. It was like a refuge for her." Jack and Sarah exchanged glances. The Elysium seemed like a promising place to continue the investigation. As they headed back to the car, Jack couldn't shake the image of the Black Rose and the note from his mind. He knew time was running out. The killer was out there, and every passing moment was an opportunity for him to strike again. However, something about this case was different. A nagging feeling told Jack that he was dealing with a formidable opponent, someone who enjoyed playing with the minds of their opponents. As they started the car and headed towards the club, Jack felt a renewed sense of determination. He wouldn't rest until the killer was found and brought to justice. The Black Rose was just the beginning, and Jack was determined to uncover all the secrets it hid. Elysium awaited them, with its promises of answers and more mysteries, and Jack Malone was ready to face the darkness, one step at a time. Chapter 3. Secrets of Elysium. Elysium, an exclusive club in Manhattan, was a place where the city's elite gathered to escape reality and lose themselves in a world of luxury and mystery. Its dark, heavy doors hid secrets few dared to uncover. Jack Malone and Sarah Carter were about to discover what lay behind that imposing facade. As they approached the club's entrance, Jack surveyed the surroundings carefully. The entrance was guarded by a robust, well-dressed doorman who scrutinized everyone entering with a keen eye. When Jack and Sarah approached, the doorman sized them up. "We're with the police," Jack said, showing his badge. "We'd like to speak with the manager." The doorman frowned but nodded, opening the door and indicating they could enter. The interior of Elysium was even more impressive. Soft lights illuminated the space, while classical music played in the background. The mahogany bar gleamed under the lights, and the well-dressed clientele murmured in discreet conversations. Sarah leaned toward Jack, whispering, "We need to be subtle here. Any false move and they might shut us out." Jack agreed. He knew that places like this protected their members and their secrets fiercely. They were greeted by an elegant man with well-combed gray hair and calculating eyes. He introduced himself as Victor Langdon, the club's manager. "What can I do for you?" Victor asked, with a polished but clearly suspicious smile. "We're investigating the murder of Emily Turner," Jack began, getting straight to the point. "We know she frequented this club, and we'd like to know more about her activities here." Victor's smile faded slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Miss Turner was indeed a regular," he said, gesturing for them to follow him to a private office. "However, we respect the privacy of our members." "Privacy is one thing," Sarah interjected. "Murder is an entirely different matter." Victor sighed, seeming to weigh his options. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, I'll cooperate as much as I can." Emily was a charming young woman, well-liked by everyone here. She often participated in our poetry nights and literary debates. As Victor spoke, Jack observed the office around him. It was a tastefully decorated room, but something about the arrangement of the furniture and the small details seemed out of place, as if the room hid more than it showed. "Did Emily mention anyone special in her life?" Jack asked. "Perhaps a boyfriend or someone she spent a lot of time with?" Victor hesitated for a moment, but answered, "Yes, there was a man, a regular at the club. They were often seen together, but he was quite reserved. He never interacted much with the other members. His name is Alexander Crowley." The name rang a bell in Jack's mind. Crowley reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was just a coincidence, but in his line of work, he knew that coincidences rarely were just that. "We need to speak with him," Sarah said, jotting down the name. "I don't know if he'll be here tonight," Victor replied, "but I can inform you when he shows up again." Jack nodded, but he knew they couldn't rely on the manager's goodwill. They needed answers, and they needed them quickly. "One more thing, Mr. Langdon," Jack said, standing up. "You mentioned that Emily participated in the poetry nights. Did she ever bring a black rose to these nights?" Victor frowned, clearly surprised by the question. "No, so's that, brat. Not I know of," he replied. "But now that you mention it, I do remember she occasionally received black roses. She said they were from a secret admirer." Jack exchanged a significant look with Sarah. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit, but the picture was still incomplete. Back on the streets of Manhattan, Jack and Sarah decided they needed to dig deeper into Alexander Crowley's life. They returned to the office to research the name, finding a trail of information that pointed to an enigmatic man with a past as dark as Elysium's secrets. As the hours passed and the night wore on, Jack couldn't shake the image of the black rose and the words on the note from his mind. He knew he was just beginning to unravel a deadly game where every move was crucial and any mistake could be fatal. In the darkness, the city continued to breathe, full of life and death, secrets and revelations. And Jack Malone was at the center of it all, determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. Shadow Games. The next morning brought with it a dense fog that covered the city like a shroud. Jack Malone and Sarah Carter were back at the office, piecing together a profile of Alexander Crowley. The information was sparse and fragmented, but what they found revealed a complex and disturbing man. Crowley was a known name in New York's literary and academic circles. A professor of literature specializing in Gothic poetry, He had a reputation for being an eccentric genius. His classes were always packed, but he kept his distance from students outside the academic environment. His personal life was a mystery, shrouded in shadows as dense as his favorite poems. While Sarah continued her research, the phone on Jack's desk rang. He answered automatically, expecting another lead or some progress in the case, but the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Detective Malone, I presume." The voice was smooth, almost seductive, but with an underlying coldness that made it frightening. "Who is this?" Jack asked, trying to keep calm. "Beauty is a mask, detective." The voice continued. "Beneath it, we are all just bones and dust. Do you think you can see through the mask?" "What do you want?" Jack interrupted, feeling the adrenaline surge. "Who are you?" "Ah, but that's the fun, isn't it?" The voice laughed, a sound that sent chills down Jack's spine. "The game is just beginning. Here's a clue. Where the light doesn't shine and secrets sleep, the next move will be revealed. The Raven is always watching." Before Jack could respond, the line went dead. He remained holding the phone, the sound of the disconnect tone still echoing in his mind. Sarah looked at him, concerned. "Who was it?" "Our killer," Jack replied, placing the phone back on the hook. "He's playing with us," and he left a riddle. "Where the light doesn't shine and secrets sleep," Sarah repeated the phrase, thoughtful. "Sounds like a dark place, maybe a hideout?" "Or a reference to something more symbolic," Jack said. "Like a place where hidden truths are buried." Jack's mind was racing. He knew the killer was controlling the game, but he also knew that any misstep could mean another life lost. They needed to act fast. "Let's review everything we know about Crowley," he said. "There might be something in his past or his writings that gives us a clue about this riddle." Sarah nodded, returning to the files. Jack grabbed a folder with Crowley's works, leafing through his poems and essays, looking for any reference that might fit the riddle. After a few hours of intense reading, something caught his attention. "Sarah, look at this," Jack said, pointing to a passage in one of Crowley's poems. "In the heart of the library, where daylight dares not enter, the secrets of the dead rest." "The library!" Sarah exclaimed. "Of course, it makes sense. Crowley spends a lot of time there, and libraries are places where literary secrets sleep, and where light doesn't shine," Jack added. "Let's head to the university library. If the killer gave us a true clue, that's where we'll find our next move." They left quickly, driving through the city to the imposing library of New York University. The Gothic building, with its high towers and narrow windows, looked like a silent guardian of ancient secrets. Upon entering, the feeling of being watched was palpable. Jack and Sarah headed to the lower floor, where old and rarely accessed archives were kept. The air was cold, and the silence almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps and the whisper of turning pages. As they explored the shelves, something caught Jack's attention, a small door at the back, almost hidden in the shadows. He approached, feeling a strange attraction to the place. Opening the door, he found a small room, filled with old books and dust. And there, in the center of the room, on an aged wooden table, was another black rose. Next to the rose, a note written in the same elegant handwriting they had found with Emily Turner. "Congratulations, detective. You found the next clue. But remember, the Raven is always watching. The game continues." Jack felt the tension mount. The killer was always one step ahead, but now Jack was also starting to understand the game. He knew he would need all his skill and cunning to catch the Raven. As night fell over New York, Jack and Sarah left the library, determined to uncover the secrets the killer hid in the shadows. The game was on, and the hunt continued. Chapter 5. Whispers in the dark night in New York brought an air of mystery, with the city lights flickering like stars in an urban sky. Jack Malone and Sarah Carter left the university library, their minds still resonating with the killer's note. The Raven was always one step ahead, but Jack was determined to break this cycle. As they returned to the office, Jack couldn't stop thinking about Alexander Crowley. He knew the literature professor was the key to solving the mystery. The library had revealed another clue, but there were still many unanswered questions. "Sarah, we need a different approach," Jack said as they sat at their desks. "Crowley is leading us where he wants, but we can't let him control the game." "I agree," Sarah replied, looking at the connections map they had set up on the wall. "What if we try to find him outside the academic environment? We should investigate his personal life, his habits, his obsessions." Jack nodded. They needed to know Crowley not just as a professor, but as a person. This meant delving deep into his past and present. The next morning, Jack and Sarah began investigating Crowley's life outside the university. They went to his apartment on the Upper West Side, an old and imposing building that perfectly matched Crowley's Gothic personality. The doorman, an elderly and friendly man, confirmed that Crowley hadn't been home for a few days, but received many mysterious visitors at night. "He has a locked room in the building's basement," the doorman said in a hushed voice. "No one but him goes in there. They say he keeps valuable things inside." Jack and Sarah knew they needed to get into that room. They convinced the doorman to let them in, promising not to cause any damage. The basement was damp and dark, with only a faint light bulb illuminating the way. They found the door the doorman mentioned, locked with a heavy padlock. Jack, using skills honed over the years, managed to open the lock. The room was a macabre sanctuary, walls covered in photos, newspaper clippings, and old books. In the center, a table with a burning black candle, illuminating a worn leather diary. Sarah picked up the diary and began flipping through it, her eyes widening as she read the entries. Crowley described his obsessions, his inspirations, and, more disturbingly, his plans. "Jack, listen to this," Sarah said, reading aloud. "Emily was perfect. Her passion for poetry made her a natural choice. The next one will be even more special. The black rose is the symbol of purity and death. The raven will guide the way." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. They were dealing with a meticulous and deeply disturbed killer. "We need to find Crowley before he makes his next move," Jack said, determined. Suddenly, Jack's phone rang. He answered, expecting another lead, but the voice he heard made his heart stop. "I see." "Detective Malone," the Raven's voice whispered. "You're doing better than I expected. But don't think you're winning. The next move will be your greatest challenge." "Where are you, you bastard?" Jack shouted, feeling anger and frustration boiling over. "All in good time, Detective," the Raven replied calmly. "Here's a new clue. In the waters where the dead meet, the next secret will be revealed." The line went dead again, leaving Jack and Sarah alone in the eerie silence of the basement. "In the waters where the dead meet," Sarah repeated, trying to decipher the riddle. "It could be a cemetery near a river, a lake, or something like that," Jack suggested. "Or it could be more symbolic, like a place where something tragic happened." Sarah grabbed a map of New York, marking all the locations that might fit the description. Jack was about to suggest a place when Sarah's phone rang. It was Lieutenant O'Hara. "Ayos. Jack, Sarah, we have another body," O'Hara said, his voice grave. "And this time, it's personal. It's one of your students, Sarah. She was found near the Hudson River." Jack and Sarah felt the weight of the news. Crowley was becoming bolder, and the stakes were rising. They needed to find the Raven before he claimed another victim. As night fell over the city, Jack and Sarah drove to the new crime scene, determined to unravel the mystery surrounding Alexander Crowley. The hunt continued, and this time, the final confrontation was closer than ever. Chapter 6. In the Waters of Death. The night was dark, with heavy clouds obscuring the moon, when Jack Malone and Sarah Carter arrived at the Hudson River's edge. The red and blue lights of police cars flashed in the distance, reflecting off the calm, dark waters of the river. The crime scene was cordoned off, with officers keeping the curious at bay while the forensic team worked. The body of the student, Julia Adams, lay on the grass near the shore. Like Emily Turner, a black rose had been left beside her. Jack felt a knot in his stomach as he approached. He knelt beside the body, examining the evidence around it. "The same signature," Sarah said, sadness in her voice. "He's taunting us." "Yes, and he's getting bolder," Jack replied, analyzing the rose. "He knew Julia was one of your students. This is a direct message to us." Lieutenant O'Hara approached, his face hardened with concern. "Jack, we need to solve this fast. The press is already on it and the city is panicking." "We're getting close, O'Hara," Jack said, standing up. "But we need more clues. Did you find anything different at this scene?" "Just this." O'Hara handed Jack a small leather pouch found near the body. Inside was an old key, with a tag that read, "Elysium." Jack and Sarah exchanged glances. Elysium again. This couldn't be a coincidence. "We need to get back to the club," Jack said, determined. "Crowley is playing with us, but he's made a mistake. He wants us to go there." With O'Hara's permission, Jack and Sarah left the crime scene and headed straight for Elysium. The drive was silent, both lost in thoughts about what they might find. They arrived at the club shortly after midnight, the place still buzzing with music and nightlife. Victor Langdon greeted them with a look of surprise, but quickly yielded to Jack's urgency. "We need to see what this key opens," Jack said, showing the old key. Victor hesitated, but led them to a back room in the club, where old locks and cabinets held the secrets of the most exclusive members. The key fit perfectly into an old oak cabinet. Inside the cabinet, they found old documents, ledgers, and a black leather journal similar to the one found in Crowley's basement. Sarah flipped the font through the pages, her eyes widening at what she read. "It's Crowley's journal," she said, holding her breath. "He mentions Julia, Emily, and several other potential victims. He details their movements, their interactions, and even their deaths." Jack took the journal, reading a passage that sent chills through him. "In the waters where the dead meet, the raven sees all. The next rose will bloom in the house of mirrors, where truth reflects and secrets reveal." "The House of Mirrors?" Sarah asked, puzzled. "Coney Island," Jack replied, already packing the journal. "There's an old house of mirrors there, abandoned for years. It was a popular spot in the 1950s, but it's now closed." Wasting no time, they left Elysium and drove to Coney Island. The drive felt interminable, but they finally arrived at the abandoned amusement park. The place was shrouded in a thin mist, and the silhouette of the House of Mirrors loomed like a sleeping monster in the darkness. Jack and Sarah approached cautiously, flashlights in hand. The doors of the House of Mirrors were ajar, creaking at Jack's touch. Inside was a labyrinth of broken mirrors and fogged glass, creating a surreal and eerie atmosphere. "Stay close," Jack said, his voice low and tense. As they moved through the maze, the distorted reflections created illusions and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the space. A whisper followed by a sinister laugh. "Ike's." "He's here," Sarah said, gripping the flashlight tighter. Jack nodded, moving deeper into the House of Mirrors. Finally, they reached a central hall, where in the middle, on a pedestal, lay another black rose. Beside the rose was an old recorder. Jack pressed play, and the raven's voice echoed through the hall. "Welcome, detective. You've reached the heart of my labyrinth. The truth is closer than ever, but beware, for the truth can be a mirror that distorts as much as it reveals. I will be watching." The message ended with a click, leaving Jack and Sarah alone in the silence. They knew the Raven was nearby, and that the final confrontation was approaching. The waters of death still hid secrets, and the House of Mirrors was about to reveal the truth they had been seeking. The tension in the air was palpable. Jack and Sarah were ready to face the Raven and solve the mystery once and for all. The game was nearing its end, and only one side would emerge victorious. Chapter 7. Reflections of Truth. The silence in the House of Mirrors was suffocating. Jack Malone and Sarah Carter were in the heart of the labyrinth, surrounded by distorted reflections that seemed to watch every move. The black rose on the pedestal and the Raven's recorded message made it clear they were in the right place. But the danger was palpable. "He's close," Sarah whispered, looking around with her flashlight. "We need to be ready for anything." Jack nodded, keeping his hand firmly on his holstered gun. They advanced cautiously through the hall, the mirrors reflecting their images in bizarre ways. Shadows danced around them, creating a sense of unease. Suddenly, a quick movement caught Jack's attention. He turned, pointing the flashlight at a dark corner, but there was nothing there. Just his and Sarah's reflections, multiplied infinitely. "He's watching us," Jack said, gritting his teeth. "And he's playing with our minds." They continued through the labyrinth, trying to ignore the reflections that seemed to come to life. The mirrored walls formed narrow corridors, each turn leading to more mirrors and more confusion. In the back of his mind, Jack knew they were getting closer. The tension grew with each step, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. Finally, they reached a large circular room, with mirrors covering all the walls. In the center was a metal chair, and an old projector that began to operate automatically, casting a flickering light across the room. On the screen, a video began to play. It was Emily Turner alive and smiling, reciting a poem. The words were by Edgar Allan Poe, Annabel Lee. The scene shifted to Julia Adams, also reciting poetry, with the same serene look. "He recorded everything," Sarah said, horrified. "It's like he's collecting trophies." Jack felt his anger rising. The Raven wasn't just a killer. He was a manipulator who played with lives as if they were pieces on a board. "Jack, look." Sarah pointed to a corner of the room where a mirror was slightly ajar. As they approached, they realized the mirror concealed a secret door. Carefully, they opened the door and entered a narrow, dark corridor. The tension was nearly unbearable, but they pressed on, determined to end the nightmare. The corridor led to a small room where Alexander Crowley sat, calmly paging through an old book. Seeing Jack and Sarah, he smiled disturbingly. "Ah, Detective Malone," Crowley said, his voice smooth and calculated. "I see you found my sanctuary." "Crowley, it's over," Jack said, pointing his gun at him. "You're under arrest for the murders of Emily Turner and Julia Adams." Crowley just laughed, a cold sound that echoed through the room. "Do you think it's that simple, Detective?" he said, rising slowly. "You don't understand the beauty of the game, the poetry in death, the power of fear." "You're a monster," Sarah said, her voice trembling with anger. "Those were lives, not pieces in a game." "Life is a game," Crowley replied, disdain in his eyes. "And I am the master of this board." Before Jack could react, Crowley pulled a blade from his coat and lunged. Jack dodged quickly, but the blade grazed his arm. He fired, but Crowley moved agilely, disappearing into the darkness of the corridor. "He's getting away!" Sarah shouted, running after him. Despite his injury, Jack followed Sarah through the mirror labyrinth. The lights flickered, creating a surreal and terrifying scene. The sound of footsteps echoed, mingling with their heavy breathing. Finally, they reached an exit. Crowley stood in the middle of the entrance hall, surrounded by police officers who had arrived after Sarah's call for backup. "Fra no zurcho e sure, Sarah dal die." "It's over, Crowley," Jack said, panting. "Surrender." Crowley looked around, evaluating his options. With a sinister smile, he raised his hands, letting the blade fall to the ground. "It seems the game is over, Detective," he said, his voice calm and resigned. The officers handcuffed him and led him away. Jack and Sarah stood still, watching as the killer was finally captured. The tension began to dissipate, but the weight of the events still hung over them. "We did it, Jack," Sarah said, with a sigh of relief. "Finally." "Yes," Jack replied, looking at the starry sky. "But the scar from this will stay with us for a long time." As the night enveloped New York, Jack knew this was just a chapter in the long story of his career. The Raven was captured, but the city's darkness would always bring new challenges and mysteries to unravel. Suddenly, Jack's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and saw an anonymous message. "You caught one raven, but blackbirds never fly alone. Deso dat zijn as balletsa. Rasa or. Vasen en etsen. Gaikse jas en axa. Vai zijn das, sorgsates, outside they try. True." The battle was far from over, and a new riddle had just been thrown down. Chapter 8. Laughter in the Shadows. The police car cut through the streets of New York, transporting Alexander Crowley to the Central Station. In the back seat, Crowley maintained an enigmatic smile, his eyes glinting with a strange satisfaction. Jack Malone and Sarah Carter were in the car, following the patrol, keeping a constant watch on the killer who was finally in custody. "Finally, this nightmare is ending," Sarah said, looking at Jack. "But something still bothers me. He surrendered too easily." Jack nodded, sharing the same unease. "He's too smart to get caught without a plan. Stay alert, Sarah. This might not be over." As they were about to reach the station, Crowley started laughing, a low, disturbing sound that quickly intensified. "Do you really think it's over?" Crowley said, his voice filled with sick pleasure. "It's only just begun, Detective." Before Jack could react, a deafening sound exploded beside him. A figure emerged from an alley, hurling a heavy object at the police car. Jack and Sarah watched in horror as a metallic jack, covered in spikes, struck the patrol car, puncturing the tires and causing it to flip several times, before stopping in the middle of the road. "What the hell was that?" Sarah screamed as Jack quickly stopped their car and rushed out to help. The patrol car was upside down, the driver unconscious and Crowley, miraculously, unharmed. He crawled out, laughing maniacally, his eyes gleaming with a cold madness. "I warned you, Detective," he shouted, his voice echoing in the deserted street. Jack ran to help Sarah out of the car, but before they could move, a shadowy figure emerged from the shadows. A hooded man with a deadly look in his eyes raised a gun and fired at Sarah. The bullet hit her neck, and she fell to the ground, blood flowing rapidly. "Sarah!" Jack screamed, running to her, but the man disappeared into the shadows, taking Crowley with him. Jack tried to staunch the blood gushing from Sarah's neck, his mind spinning in panic and desperation. Minutes felt like hours as he pressed the wound, trying to keep Sarah conscious. "Stay with me, Sarah," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "Don't leave me now." The sirens of the ambulances sounded in the distance, and within minutes, paramedics were by their side, quickly taking Sarah to the hospital. Jack stood there, in the deserted street, feeling rage and frustration boil within him. Crowley had escaped again, and now Sarah was fighting for her life. Back at the hospital, Jack waited anxiously for news about Sarah. Doctors came and went from the operating room as he paced back and forth, unable to think of anything but his partner and friend. Hours later, a doctor finally appeared, looking tired but hopeful. "She's stable," he said. "The shot was critical, but we managed to stop the bleeding and repair the damage. She'll need time to recover, but she will survive." Jack let out a sigh of relief, feeling a massive weight lift from his shoulders. But the battle was far from over. Crowley was still out there, and he needed to be stopped. In the following days, Jack dedicated himself entirely to tracking down Crowley and the man who had helped him escape. The leads were scarce, but Jack's determination was unwavering. He knew the Raven wouldn't rest until he completed his sick game, and Jack was determined to stop him. While Sarah recovered in the hospital, Jack found new clues that led him to an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. With a team of officers, he stormed the location, ready to confront Crowley once and for all. The final confrontation was about to happen, and Jack knew he needed to be prepared for anything. The Raven had played his last cards, but Jack Malone was ready to end the game. With a heavy heart but firm determination, Jack advanced into the darkness of the factory, each step bringing him closer to truth and justice. The end was near, and Jack was determined to win, no matter the cost. Chapter 9. The Final Game. The abandoned factory on the city's outskirts seemed like a forgotten shadow of the past, but that night it became the stage for the final showdown. Jack Malone and his team of officers surrounded the building, ready to capture Alexander Crowley and his accomplice. The tension was palpable, each officer bracing for the worst. Jack led the team through the main entrance, his eyes quickly adjusting to the darkness. Shadows danced on the walls, creating a sinister and charged atmosphere. They advanced carefully, their steps echoing on the concrete floor. Suddenly the sound of an engine began to reverberate through the factory. Jack ran to a window and saw Crowley and his accomplice getting into a car. They were ready to flee. "They're escaping!" Jack shouted, running to his own car as the other officers tried to block the exit. Crowley and his accomplice accelerated, breaking through the police barrier and speeding down the road. Jack didn't hesitate. He jumped into his car and gave chase. The city lights flickered in the distance as the pursuit progressed through the dark, deserted streets. The chase was fierce, the cars flying through the streets at a frightening speed. Jack kept his eyes fixed on the car ahead, feeling the adrenaline surge through his veins. He knew this was his last chance to capture Crowley. Minutes passed like hours until Crowley's car lost control on a sharp turn. The vehicle rolled several times before coming to a stop, upside down, in the middle of the road. Jack braked hard, getting out of his car with his gun drawn. Crowley's accomplice was dead, his body trapped in the twisted wreckage of the car. But Crowley, miraculously, crawled out, bloodied but alive. He looked at Jack with a cold smile, raising his hands in surrender. "I surrender, detective," he said, his voice calm and controlled. "This game was intense, but now it's over. I surrender." Jack stopped, the gun trembling in his hands. He thought of Sarah, fighting for her life in the hospital, and all of Crowley's victims. The anger and pain he felt were overwhelming. Tears began to stream down Jack's face as he pointed the gun at Crowley. "No, Crowley," Jack said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Today, there will be no justice. Today, there will be revenge." Before Crowley could react, Jack pulled the trigger. The shots echoed into the night, piercing the silence with their fury. Crowley fell to the ground, the smile fading from his face as life drained from his body. Jack stood there, eyes fixed on Crowley's lifeless body. He knew he'd crossed a line, but the pain and loss were too much to bear. He fell to his knees, the weight of his actions crushing his soul. The officers arrived soon after, surrounding the scene and trying to understand what had happened. Lieutenant O'Hara approached Jack, helping him to his feet. "Jack, what have you done?" O'Hara asked, his voice full of shock and concern. "I did what needed to be done," Jack replied, his voice empty. As night enveloped New York, Jack knew his life would never be the same. He had defeated the Raven, but at a terrible price. Justice had been set aside that night, replaced by bitter vengeance. Jack Malone, the detective with a scarred face and a soul marked by pain, now walked a dark path. He knew there would always be another mystery, another case, but the scar from that final confrontation would stay with him forever. The Raven was dead, but the shadows of his actions would continue to haunt the city and Jack's life. And as the stars shone over New York, Jack promised himself that somehow he would find his way back to the light, one step at a time. Chapter 10. Sarah's Recovery and the detective's hope. The days following the final confrontation were long and difficult for Jack Malone. The death of Alexander Crowley brought a strange sense of relief, but also a cloud of regret and darkness that hovered over his conscience. He knew that his decision that night would haunt him forever, but there was something that still gave him strength to carry on: Sarah's recovery. Sarah Carter was admitted to the best hospital in New York, fighting to recover from the gunshot that nearly took her life. Jack was by her side every day, holding her hand, hoping she would open her eyes and give him the smile he so longed to see again. Finally, one morning, as the rising sun bathed the hospital room with a soft golden light, Sarah began to awaken. Her eyes slowly opened, and she blinked a few times before focusing on Jack's tired but relieved face. "Jack," she whispered, her voice weak but full of life. "Sarah!" Jack exclaimed, holding her hand more firmly. "You're back! I was so worried." Sarah tried to smile, though the pain was still present. "I was worried too. What happened? Crowley, Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the truth he needed to share. "Crowley is dead," he said, his voice low. I killed him, Sarah. He surrendered, but I couldn't let him live after everything he did." Sarah looked at him with understanding and sadness. She knew Jack better than anyone and understood how much that decision had cost him. "Jack, you did what you thought was necessary," she said softly. "And now we need to move forward, together." The following weeks were filled with recovery and reflection. Sarah, with her strength and determination, gradually regained her health, transforming from a fragile patient into a warrior ready to face the world again. Jack was by her side every step of the way, finding new hope and purpose in her recovery. One day, while they were walking through the park, Sarah stopped and looked at Jack. "You know, Jack, I think this city still needs us," she said with a smile. "There are many mysteries to solve, many people who need help, and I want to be there, by your side, facing it all." Jack looked at her, feeling a new flame of determination ignite within him. He knew the darkness would always be there, but he also knew that, with Sarah by his side, he could find the light again. "You're right, Sarah," he replied, smiling back. "New York still needs us, and as long as we're together, nothing can stop us." Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for Jack Malone and Sarah Carter. They continued to work together, solving cases and facing new challenges. The scar on Jack's face was a constant reminder of the battles they had fought, but it was also a symbol of their resilience and courage. And as they walked the streets of New York, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but with Sarah by his side, he was ready to face anything that came their way. The city might be full of shadows and mysteries, but for Jack Malone and Sarah Carter, each new day brought the promise of a better future, one step at a time. Justice had finally prevailed, and hope was reborn in the hearts of those who never gave up fighting for it. And so, in the illuminated streets of New York, a new era of determination and courage began to take shape, with Jack and Sarah ready to face the unknown together.